The bulldozer's engine coughed black smoke into the gray October sky, then died with a shudder that seemed to shake the entire junkyard. Maya Thornton stood in the operator's cage, her hands still gripping controls that no longer responded, and watched her last chance at saving the family construction business collapse into silence. The machine had been running for maybe 40 seconds, just long enough to give her hope before taking it away. Around her, mountains of rusted metal stretched toward the horizon, a graveyard of equipment that had outlived its usefulness, and she wondered if she was looking at her own future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The funeral had been 6 days ago. The bank's final notice, 3 days. The equipment auction scheduled for this coming Friday, and now this morning, Maya found herself in Eddie Kowalski's salvage yard on the outskirts of Millerton, Pennsylvania, gambling on a bulldozer that nobody else wanted. The D8 Caterpillar sat half buried in mud and weeds, its yellow paint faded to the color of old bruises, its blade twisted from some long-ago collision that had sent it here to die. Eddie had quoted her $12,000, which was exactly $12,000 more than she had in any account that mattered. But he'd also offered terms that only desperation could make attractive: take the dozer, get it running, and pay him back from whatever jobs she could scrape together before the bank took everything else. The Thornton construction yard occupied 5 acres of Pennsylvania clay just off Route 17, land that had been in her family since her grandfather came back from Korea with a government loan and a dream of building things that would last. The main office was a double-wide trailer that her father had always promised to replace with something permanent, a promise that joined all the others he'd made and never kept. The equipment barn leaned against the hillside like it was tired of standing, its corrugated roof patched with mismatched panels from 3 decades of storms. A half-dozen pickups in various states of decay lined the fence, their beds still carrying the Thornton logo that her mother had designed 30 years ago, back when the family name still meant quality and reliability instead of broken contracts and unpaid invoices. Maya had grown up in the operator's seat of heavy equipment, learning to read soil composition and grade elevation before she'd mastered algebra. Her father, Jack Thornton, had been one of the best Finnish graders in 3 counties, capable of shaping land to tolerances that made engineers shake their heads in admiration. But he'd also been one of the worst businessmen those same counties had ever seen, taking jobs for too little money, extending credit to clients who never paid, drinking away profits on weekends that stretched into weeks. The cancer took him in August, leaving behind debts that exceeded assets by a ratio that made the family lawyer actually wince when he explained the numbers. Maya climbed down from the dead bulldozer and circled it slowly, seeing problems accumulate with each step. The tracks were worn nearly smooth, thousands of dollars to replace. Hydraulic lines wept fluid from a dozen connections, suggesting seals throughout the system had deteriorated. The engine compartment, when she forced open the corroded access panel, revealed a nightmare of jury-rigged repairs, aftermarket parts, and modifications that violated every principle of proper maintenance. Someone had owned this machine and worked it hard without caring what happened after they were done with it. Eddie appeared from behind a pile of crushed cars, wiping his hands on a rag that might have been white sometime during the previous century. He was 60-something, built like a fire hydrant, with the kind of face that had seen every possible way machinery could fail and the people who depended on it along with them. His salvage yard had been Maya's classroom for the practical education her father never bothered providing, the place where she'd learned that understanding how things broke was just as important as knowing how they worked. "She's rough," Eddie said, which was his way of acknowledging that the bulldozer was probably beyond redemption. But the engine turned over, and the hydraulics held pressure for almost a minute before the seals gave out. "That's more than most of the junk I get in here." Maya looked at the machine that represented either salvation or final bankruptcy. "How long do I have before you need payment?" Eddie's expression suggested he already knew the answer mattered more than the question. "I can give you 90 days. After that, I got other buyers who'll take her for scrap metal. 20 tons of steel is worth something even if the equipment's worthless." She thought about the bank notice sitting on her kitchen table, about the equipment auction that would strip the Thornton yard of everything that could be sold, about the clients who'd already started calling to ask if their deposits were safe. 90 days wasn't long enough to rebuild a business that her father had spent years destroying, but it might be enough to salvage something. Enough to pay off the critical debts and walk away with dignity instead of bankruptcy. Deal, she heard herself say, then wondered if desperation had finally driven her completely insane. The process of extracting the bulldozer from Eddie's yard took most of the afternoon. The machine wouldn't start again despite Maya's best efforts, so they used Eddie's old wrecker to drag it onto a lowboy trailer borrowed from a friend who still owed the Thornton family favors from years back. By the time they secured the load and Maya climbed into the cab of her pickup, the sun was setting behind the hills that ringed Millerton, painting the sky in shades that reminded her of rust and old blood. The drive back to the Thornton yard took her through town, past businesses that had watched her grow up and watched her father drink himself into an early grave. Morrison's Hardware, where Jack Thornton had maintained a running account that he'd paid down in irregular bursts whenever a job finally came through. The Railside Tavern, where he'd spent too many evenings explaining to anyone who'd listen how the construction business had changed, how nobody appreciated quality work anymore, how he'd been cheated by clients and suppliers and fate itself. The First National Bank, where loan officers had learned to recognize the Thornton name as a synonym for risk. Maya's apartment sat above what used to be her mother's bakery, back before the divorce and the bankruptcy that had sent Catherine Thornton to Arizona to live with her sister and forget that Pennsylvania or the Thornton family had ever existed. The space still smelled faintly of bread despite 15 years of other tenants, a ghost of better times that Maya found either comforting or depressing depending on her mood. She climbed the narrow stairs carrying exhaustion like a physical weight and found her younger brother Danny sitting on the landing, his back against her door. He was 22, 8 years younger than Maya, with their father's broad shoulders and their mother's inability to finish anything he started. He dropped out of trade school to help with the business during Jack's final illness, then discovered that helping meant watching their father make increasingly erratic decisions while the debts piled higher. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You bought the dozer," Danny said. It wasn't a question. Word traveled fast in a town where heavy equipment moving through the streets was notable entertainment. "I bought a chance," Maya corrected, unlocking the door. "Whether it's worth anything depends on what I find when I start tearing into that machine." Danny followed her inside, past furniture that had belonged to their grandparents and walls decorated with photographs that documented a family's slow dissolution. "Maya, we need to talk about Friday. The auction. Some of the guys called asking if they should show up, if there's any point in bidding on the equipment, trying to keep it in friendly hands." She dropped her keys on the kitchen counter and stared at the bank notice she'd been avoiding all week. The auction would liquidate everything: the backhoe that her grandfather had bought new in 1967, the excavator that Jack had purchased during a brief period of prosperity in the 90s, the trucks and trailers and tools that represented 3 generations of the Thornton family's attempt to build something permanent. "Tell them not to bother," Maya said quietly. "The bank's going to take what they're owed, and whatever's left won't be worth keeping. Better to let it go to strangers who don't know the history." Danny was quiet for a moment, then asked the question she'd been dreading. "What about the yard itself? The land?" The land was different. The land had been paid off decades ago, transferred into a family trust that even Jack Thornton's financial incompetence couldn't completely destroy. The bank could take the equipment, but the 5 acres of Pennsylvania clay belonged to the family regardless of what debts consumed everything else. "The land stays ours," Maya said. "For whatever that's worth without equipment to work it." She spent that evening in her apartment, reviewing documents that told the story of a business's collapse in spreadsheets and legal notices. Her father had been brilliant at the actual work of construction, capable of moving earth with precision that bordered on artistry, but he'd treated contracts like suggestions and finances like problems that would solve themselves if ignored long enough. The final year had been particularly catastrophic: jobs taken at prices that didn't cover costs, clients who'd failed to pay for completed work, equipment repairs deferred until minor problems became major failures. But scattered among the wreckage of financial disaster, Maya found something that didn't quite fit. A series of deposits into Jack Thornton's personal account, irregular amounts ranging from $2,000 to $8,000, appearing every few months over the past 5 years. The deposits had no clear source, no notation explaining where the money came from, and they'd stopped abruptly about 6 months before his death. The amounts were significant enough to matter but not large enough to change the fundamental trajectory of the business's collapse. She called Danny, who answered on the fourth ring with the groggy confusion of someone who'd fallen asleep in front of the television. "Do you know anything about Dad getting money from somewhere besides construction jobs? Regular deposits that don't match any contracts I can find?" Danny was quiet long enough that Maya wondered if he'd fallen back asleep. Then his voice came through, careful and measured in a way that suggested he'd been expecting this question. "He never told you about the side work?" "What side work?" Danny sighed, and Maya could picture him sitting up, running his hands through hair that never quite laid flat. Dad had been doing consulting for someone. "I don't know all the details because he wouldn't talk about it, but starting maybe 5 years ago, he'd disappear for weekends, sometimes longer. He'd come back with cash, said it was engineering consultation for a private client who valued discretion. He made me promise not to mention it to you because you'd ask too many questions." Maya felt anger building, the familiar frustration of discovering that her father had been keeping secrets while the family business collapsed around them. "Who was the client?" "I told you," he wouldn't say. "But I know it had something to do with old equipment, heavy machinery from back in the day. One time I saw plans in his truck, engineering drawings for some kind of vintage bulldozer. When I asked about it, he got defensive, said some things were better left alone." The conversation ended with more questions than answers, and Maya found herself staring at her ceiling until past midnight, trying to reconcile the father she'd known with this secretive version who'd been earning money he never reported and working on projects he refused to discuss. Jack Thornton had been many things: a skilled operator, a terrible businessman, an inconsistent father, but he'd never been particularly good at keeping secrets. The fact that he'd hidden this consulting work suggested it mattered in ways she didn't yet understand. The next morning arrived with rain that turned the Thornton yard into a mud pit that would have been merely inconvenient if they'd still had functioning equipment to work with. Maya stood at the window of the office trailer, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous geological era, and watched water pool around the foundations of buildings that would soon belong to the bank's recovery department. The lowboy trailer with its cargo of dubious salvations sat in the equipment barn, the bulldozer still chained down like it might try to escape if given the opportunity. Maya had planned to start the teardown this morning, beginning the process of diagnosing everything wrong with the machine and calculating whether Eddie's $12,000 gamble had any chance of paying off. But Danny's revelation about their father's secret consulting work had planted questions that demanded answers before she could focus on practical mechanics. She drove to the county records office, a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed architecture should punish the people forced to use it. 3 hours of searching through property transfers, business licenses, and construction permits produced nothing useful. Whatever Jack Thornton had been consulting on, it hadn't left traces in official records. Her next stop was Morrison's Hardware, where Old Man Morrison had known her father since they'd served together in the volunteer fire department 30 years ago. The store smelled like sawdust and machine oil, familiar scents that reminded Maya of childhood trips where Jack would spend hours discussing the relative merits of different fasteners while she explored aisles of tools and equipment. Morrison looked up from a parts catalog as she entered, his expression carrying the complicated sympathy of someone who'd watched a family's slow dissolution from close range. "Maya, heard you bought Eddie's problem dozer." "That's either brave or crazy, and I'm not sure which." "Probably both," Maya admitted, approaching the counter where 3 generations of Millerton contractors had bought supplies on credit that Morrison extended based on handshakes in history. "I need to ask you about something though. Did my dad ever mention doing consulting work for anyone? Private jobs that weren't part of the regular business?" Morrison's face closed down in a way that confirmed he knew exactly what she was talking about. "Your father's business was his own, Maya. Not my place to discuss it. His business is bankrupt, and I'm trying to understand why someone with regular consulting income still couldn't pay his bills. If you know something that might help, I'd appreciate hearing it." The old man was quiet for a long moment, weighing loyalty to a dead friend against compassion for a daughter trying to salvage something from disaster. Finally, he pulled out a stool and gestured for Maya to sit. "About 5 years back, your father came in asking about materials for an unusual project. Specialized welding equipment, precision measuring tools, metallurgy supplies. Stuff we don't normally stock for regular construction work. When I asked what he was building, he said he was helping someone restore vintage heavy equipment, but he wouldn't say who or where. Did he ever mention what kind of equipment?" Morrison shook his head. "But I got the impression it was something significant. He bought reference books on old construction machinery, spent hours studying engineering manuals from the 40s and 50s. Whatever he was working on, it mattered to him in a way the regular business never did." Maya left the hardware store with more questions and a growing conviction that her father's secret project was connected to the mysterious bulldozer now sitting in the Thornton equipment barn. The timing aligned too perfectly, the consulting work starting around the same time, the focus on vintage machinery, the need for specialized tools and materials. Back at the yard, she found the office trailer occupied by Marcus Webb, the family's lawyer, a man who'd spent 20 years trying to protect the Thorntons from Jack's worst impulses and failing more often than he succeeded. He looked up from documents spread across the conference table with the expression of someone delivering news that couldn't possibly get worse but probably would anyway. "Maya, I've been going through your father's papers again, and I found something that changes the timeline for the auction. There's a lien against the equipment I'd missed before, filed by a company called Garrison Industrial Holdings. They're claiming Jack owed them money for materials and services related to a restoration project, and they're arguing they have priority over the bank's claims." Maya felt a cold certainty settling into her chest. "How much are they claiming?" $47,000, plus interest and legal fees. And they've filed an injunction to block Friday's auction until their claim is resolved. Which means nothing gets sold until we either pay them off or prove their lien isn't valid." Marcus handed her a legal document dense with the language of commercial litigation. "But here's the interesting part, I can't find any record of Thornton Construction ever doing business with Garrison Industrial. No contracts, no invoices, no correspondence. It's like they appeared out of nowhere with a claim against equipment they have no documented connection to." Maya studied the papers, seeing patterns that suggested her father's secret consulting work had been more complicated and more dangerous than Danny had realized. Someone out there believed Jack Thornton owed them money, and they were willing to tie up the family's remaining assets to collect it. The question was whether they were legitimate creditors or something more threatening. That evening, Maya finally began the work she'd been avoiding, the systematic teardown of the bulldozer that represented either salvation or final disaster. She rolled back the equipment barn's main doors and positioned work lights around the machine, turning night into an artificial day that illuminated every flaw and failure in unforgiving detail. The bulldozer was a Caterpillar D8 from the early 1960s, built during an era when heavy equipment was designed to be rebuilt indefinitely rather than replaced. Someone had worked this machine hard over decades. There were patterns visible in scored cylinders and eroded pivot points. But someone had also maintained it with care that went beyond simple functionality, modifications and repairs that showed deep understanding of mechanical principles. Maya started with the engine, removing the access panels to expose the diesel power plant that Eddie claimed had turned over before the seals failed. What she found was a study in contradictions, parts that should have been replaced decades ago still functioning adequately, while components that should have lasted were prematurely worn. The fuel injection system had been modified with custom machined parts that improved efficiency but complicated maintenance. The cooling system incorporated innovations that wouldn't become standard until years after this machine was built. She was photographing an unusual modification to the oil filtration system when her flashlight beam caught something that didn't belong, a seam in the bulldozer's frame that shouldn't exist. The main chassis was supposed to be a single welded assembly, but this machine had a section that appeared to have been added later, welded in place with skill that made the modification nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Maya ran her hands along the seam, feeling for access points or fasteners. The modification was approximately 3 feet long and 8 inches deep, creating a cavity within the frame that served no apparent mechanical purpose. After 20 minutes of searching, she found the release mechanism, a bolt that looked standard but was actually threaded in reverse, designed to be loosened by someone who understood it was different from everything around it. The panel came free with a metallic scrape that echoed through the quiet barn. Behind it was a compartment lined with oiled canvas, and inside that compartment was something that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. Bundles of currency, old hundreds and fifties, along with a weathered leather journal and a metal box secured with a combination lock. She reached into the compartment with hands that trembled slightly, extracting the journal first. The cover was embossed with initials that made her heart skip, J.T., her father's initials, but the handwriting inside belonged to someone else. Someone whose precise engineering notation filled pages with calculations, measurements, and observations about heavy equipment restoration. The first page carried a date from 7 years ago and a name that meant nothing to Maya, but would soon mean everything. The private restoration notes of Vincent Garrison, Master Heavy Equipment Engineer, for Project Reclamation. Outside the barn, rain continued to fall on land that had seen generations of struggle and survival. Inside, Maya Thornton sat beside a bulldozer that contained secrets her father had died protecting, holding a journal that would either explain everything or destroy what little remained of the family she'd been trying to save. The money in the hidden compartment represented more than she'd seen in years, possibly enough to pay off the critical debts and salvage the business. But the journal and the locked box suggested that accepting that money would come with costs she couldn't yet calculate. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, just 5 words that confirmed her fears and changed everything. Your father knew too much. Maya stared at the text message until the screen went dark, then read it again when she woke the phone. Your father knew too much. 5 words that transformed the hidden compartment from a discovery into a threat, the cash from salvation into evidence of something that had gotten Jack Thornton killed. She sat in the equipment barn surrounded by the dismantled bulldozer, the journal open on her lap, and tried to reconstruct her father's final years through the lens of secrets he'd kept from everyone who loved him. The consulting work that Danny had mentioned, the mysterious deposits, the specialized tools Morrison remembered selling, all of it pointed toward a project that had consumed Jack Thornton's attention while his legitimate business collapsed around him. The journal belonged to Vincent Garrison, according to the inscription, and the early entries read like standard restoration documentation. Measurements of worn components, calculations for replacement parts, observations about manufacturing techniques from the 1960s. But as Maya read deeper, the technical notes gave way to something darker. References to discoveries that couldn't be reported, to modifications that served purposes beyond simple mechanical function, to pressure from interests that wanted certain knowledge to remain buried. She counted the money 3 times, arriving at the same impossible total each time. $73,000 in bills that ranged from decades old to relatively recent. More than enough to pay off Garrison Industrial Holdings' lien and cover the most critical debts. But accepting money from a hidden compartment in a bulldozer connected to her father's secret work felt like stepping into a trap she couldn't yet see. The metal box remained locked, its combination unknown. Maya examined it under the work lights, noting scratches around the dial that suggested someone had tried to force it open and failed. The box was old, military surplus from its markings, built to protect contents from fire and water and unauthorized access. Whatever Vincent Garrison had locked inside mattered enough to secure it properly. Her phone rang, shattering the barn's silence. The number was local but unfamiliar. She answered cautiously, half expecting another threat. Miss Thornton, this is Robert Chen. I'm an attorney representing Garrison Industrial Holdings. I understand you've taken possession of certain equipment that may contain property belonging to my client. We need to discuss the situation before it becomes more complicated. Maya felt anger cutting through her fear. Your client filed a fraudulent lien against my family's equipment. I've got lawyers who can prove we never did business with Garrison Industrial. Chen's voice remained professionally neutral, the kind of careful tone that suggested expensive legal training. Miss Thornton, the situation is more nuanced than you may realize. Your father was involved in a restoration project that Vincent Garrison funded. When that project ended prematurely, certain materials and documentation remained unaccounted for. My client is simply seeking to recover what belongs to him. Then your client can explain in court why he had $47,000 in a bulldozer and sent threatening text messages. Maya heard her voice rising and forced herself to stay calm. I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing. The lien gets withdrawn by tomorrow morning, or I'm filing complaints with every regulatory agency that has jurisdiction. There was a pause on Chen's end, long enough that Maya wondered if the connection had dropped. Then his voice returned, harder and more direct. Miss Thornton, you're holding materials that don't belong to you. Materials that certain parties have been searching for over a considerable period. I strongly advise you to cooperate before this situation escalates beyond legal proceedings. The call ended, leaving Maya alone with the certainty that her father's secret project had involved people who viewed the law as a minor inconvenience rather than an actual constraint. She photographed every page of Garrison's journal, uploaded the images to cloud storage, then hid the original in a location that would take serious effort to find. The money went into a bank deposit bag that she locked in the office trailer's safe. The metal box she kept with her, deciding that whatever it contained was important enough to protect until she understood the full situation. Sleep didn't come that night. Maya lay in her apartment listening to rain hammer against windows and tried to piece together a narrative that made sense. Vincent Garrison had hired her father to work on a restoration project 7 years ago. The project had involved modifications to heavy equipment that went beyond simple mechanical repair. Something about the work had attracted attention from parties who wanted it stopped or controlled. And somewhere in that sequence of events, $73,000 in cash in a locked box had ended up hidden in a bulldozer that nobody was supposed to find. Dawn brought Danny to her door, looking like he'd slept even less than she had. His eyes were red, his hands shaking slightly as he held out an envelope that had been pushed under his apartment door sometime during the night. "You need to read this," he said, his voice carrying a tremor that Maya had never heard before. "It's from Dad. He wrote it before he died." The letter was in Jack Thornton's handwriting, shakier than Maya remembered but still recognizable. It was dated 3 weeks before his death, written during a period when the cancer had already stolen most of his strength. "Maya and Danny, if you're reading this, it means I ran out of time to fix the mess I created. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but mostly I'm sorry that I'm about to make your lives more complicated than they already are. 7 years ago, I met a man named Vincent Garrison who claimed to be a collector of vintage heavy equipment. He offered me good money to help restore a D8 bulldozer that he'd acquired from a government surplus auction. The work seemed straightforward at first: rebuild the engine, replace worn components, get the machine running again. But as I got deeper into the restoration, I realized the bulldozer wasn't what Garrison claimed it was. The machine had been modified, heavily and carefully, by someone who understood both mechanical engineering and the need for secrecy. There were hidden compartments built into the frame, modifications to the hydraulic systems that served no apparent purpose, and most significantly, a complete set of engineering documents sealed inside the main chassis. Documents that detailed construction projects from the 1950s, projects that were supposed to have been destroyed decades ago. Garrison wanted those documents. He'd spent years tracking down equipment from a specific military construction unit, convinced that hidden documentation would reveal locations of materials that had been buried and forgotten. I didn't understand the full implications until I'd already found what he was looking for, and by then it was too late to walk away without consequences. The documents detailed locations of equipment and material stockpiles that the military had buried across Pennsylvania and neighboring states during the Cold War. Backup supplies in case of Soviet invasion, heavy machinery and construction materials hidden in locations that could support resistance operations. The military had lost track of most of these sites over the decades, but the engineers who created them had kept detailed records that ended up hidden in equipment that was supposed to be scrapped. Garrison wasn't just a collector. He was a salvage operator who'd figured out that millions of dollars worth of buried equipment was sitting under private land across multiple states. Equipment that legally belonged to the government but which nobody was looking for anymore. He wanted the documents so he could locate the burial sites and extract the materials before anyone realized what he was doing. I made a mistake. I kept copies of the documents before I gave Garrison the originals. I told myself it was insurance, protection in case he decided I knew too much. But what I really wanted was leverage, proof that could force him to pay what the information was worth rather than what he'd initially offered. Garrison found out about the copies. He sent people to convince me to hand them over. When I refused, things got ugly. Threats against the family, against the business, suggestions that accidents could happen to people who didn't cooperate. I managed to stall him by claiming the copies were hidden somewhere he'd never find without my help, but I knew eventually he'd run out of patience. The money in the Bulldozer was payment for work I'd already done, money Garrison gave me before our relationship soured. I hid it because I didn't want anyone asking questions about where it came from. The locked box contains the document copies, everything Garrison has been searching for. The combination is your mother's birthday, the full date and numbers. I know I'm leaving you with problems you didn't create and shouldn't have to solve. The lien that Garrison Industrial will probably file after I'm gone is leverage to force you to give up the documents. He thinks if he can tie up the equipment legally, you'll eventually trade the information to make the problem go away. Don't do it. Those documents represent government property that Garrison wants to steal. If you give them to him, you become part of the theft. If you go to the authorities, you might face questions about why I had them in the first place. The best option is to destroy everything and walk away, let Garrison believe the documents were lost when I died. But if you decide to use the information, know that every burial site those documents reveal belongs to taxpayers who funded the original construction. The materials could be worth millions if recovered legally, through proper channels that compensate the government and the landowners. There are people at the Defense Department who would be interested in recovering assets that were written off decades ago. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to handle this properly while I was alive. I'm sorry I let the business fail while I was chasing Garrison's money. Mostly I'm sorry that I'm leaving you to clean up a disaster that I created through greed and stupidity. The land is yours, free and clear. Whatever else happens, hold on to the land. It's the only thing I managed not to destroy completely. Maya read the letter twice, then handed it to Danny and watched his expression shift from confusion to understanding to anger. When he finished, he looked up with eyes that held accusation and hurt in equal measure. He knew, Danny said quietly. He knew Garrison was dangerous, knew the documents could get us killed, and he still kept them. Still played games with information that should have been destroyed or reported. He was trying to find leverage, Maya said, though she wasn't sure if she was defending their father or simply stating facts. He thought if he had something Garrison needed, he could negotiate from a position of strength. How'd that work out for him? Danny's voice carried bitterness that 7 years of watching their father's decline had earned. He died broke, scared, and leaving us holding evidence of government property theft. That's not leverage, that's a time bomb. Maya walked to the office trailer's window and stared out at the equipment yard that would be auctioned in 3 days unless Garrison's lien blocked the sale. The rain had stopped, leaving the morning gray and cold, the kind of weather that made the land look exhausted. She thought about the documents locked in a box designed to survive fire and disaster, about government property buried across multiple states, about the difference between salvaging history and committing theft. We need to open the box, she said finally. We need to know exactly what Dad was protecting before we decide what to do with it. The combination worked on the first try. Her mother's birthday translated into numbers that clicked the lock open with a sound that felt like crossing a threshold. Inside the box were documents that confirmed everything Jack Thornton's letter had described. Engineering surveys from 1952 through 1957, detailing locations where the Army Corps of Engineers had buried construction equipment, fuel supplies, and strategic materials across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Maryland. The surveys included GPS coordinates that had been added later, someone translating the original landmark descriptions into modern navigation data. Maya spread the documents across the conference table and tried to calculate what they represented. Dozens of burial sites, each containing equipment that would be worth tens of thousands of dollars if recovered in working condition. bulldozers, excavators, generators, all sealed in protective containers and buried in locations chosen for accessibility and concealment. The total value could easily exceed $10 million, possibly much more if the equipment had been preserved properly. "This is insane," Danny said, studying a survey that detailed a burial site less than 30 miles from Millerton. They buried a D7 bulldozer and support equipment in the State Forest Preserve. Just put it in the ground and covered it up, assuming they'd come back for it if the Soviets invaded. And then forgot about it when the invasion never came, Maya finished. The Cold War ended, priorities changed, and nobody bothered to dig up equipment that seemed obsolete compared to modern machinery. Danny looked up from the documents, his expression troubled. "Maya, if we report this to the government, do we get any compensation? For finding it, for Dad's work documenting the locations?" "Maybe, probably not. This is government property that was never officially abandoned. Best case, we get a finder's fee that's a fraction of the actual value. Worst case, we get investigated for possessing classified documents. And if we give it to Garrison? Then he uses the information to illegally salvage millions of dollars worth of equipment, and we become accessories to federal theft. Plus, we're trusting a man who threatened our family and possibly contributed to Dad's stress during his final months." They sat in silence, weighing impossible choices. Outside, a truck pulled into the yard, and Maya recognized Marcus Webb's sedan followed by a vehicle she didn't know. The lawyer climbed out looking grim, and the second car disgorged two men in suits that screamed federal authority. Marcus entered the trailer without knocking, his expression carrying the kind of professional concern that preceded very bad news. "Maya, these gentlemen are from the Defense Department's Asset Recovery Division. They have questions about materials that may have come into your father's possession." The older of the two agents, a man who introduced himself as Special Agent Keller, had the weathered competence of someone who'd spent decades dealing with situations that existed in the gray areas between law and necessity. His partner, younger and sharper-edged, remained silent but watchful. "Miss Thornton," Keller began, settling into a chair without being invited, "we've been tracking Vincent Garrison's activities for several years. We're aware that your father worked with Garrison on equipment restoration projects. We're also aware that Garrison has been searching for documentation related to Cold War-era construction projects. I'm here to ask if you found anything that might be relevant to our investigation." Maya glanced at Danny, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his expression. The documents sat in the locked box less than 10 feet from where the agent was sitting, evidence that could either clear her family of wrongdoing or implicate them in theft. "What happens if I have found something?" she asked carefully. "What happens to the information and to my family?" Keller's expression remained neutral. "That depends on what you've found and how cooperative you're willing to be. The materials Garrison has been seeking belong to the federal government. Possession of classified documents, even inadvertently, can result in serious legal consequences. However, cooperation with our investigation would be viewed favorably." His partner spoke for the first time, voice carrying an edge that Keller's professional neutrality had concealed. "We know your father kept copies of documents that Garrison provided. We know those copies detail the locations of government assets worth millions of dollars. And we know Garrison is prepared to take extreme measures to recover that information. So you can either help us or you can wait until Garrison's people come looking for what they believe you're hiding." Maya felt the weight of decisions crystallizing around her. Her father had tried to play both sides, keeping documents as insurance while taking Garrison's money, and the strategy had left his children holding evidence that powerful interests wanted badly enough to threaten and possibly kill for. "I need guarantees," she said finally. "Written immunity for my family, compensation for the work my father did documenting these sites, and protection if Garrison decides to escalate beyond legal threats." Keller nodded slowly. "I can arrange immunity and protection. Compensation depends on the value of the information you provide and whether it leads to successful asset recovery. But I can promise that cooperation will be substantially better for your family than the alternatives." Maya retrieved the locked box and set it on the conference table. Inside are engineering surveys detailing burial sites across 3 states. My father spent years verifying the locations and updating the documentation with modern GPS coordinates. Garrison paid him for the work, then tried to force him to hand over copies when their relationship ended. My father refused, and I think the stress contributed to his decline during his final months. Keller examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. This is exactly what we've been searching for. Asset Recovery has known about the burial sites theoretically, but we lost the original documentation decades ago. If these surveys are accurate, we're looking at one of the largest Cold War recovery operations ever attempted. What happens now? Maya asked, feeling the situation shift from her control into the machinery of federal bureaucracy. Now we verify the locations and begin recovery operations. Keller looked up from the documents, his expression carrying something that might have been respect. Your father did good work here, Miss Thornton. The GPS coordinates and condition assessments would have taken our teams years to compile. This documentation could save taxpayers millions in recovery costs. And Garrison? Garrison is going to be very disappointed when he learns that the information he's been pursuing is now in federal custody. The younger agent's voice carried satisfaction. We've been building a case against him for years, but he's been careful to stay just inside legal boundaries. This gives us leverage to shut down his entire operation. After the agents left with the documents and a promise to return with formal immunity agreements, Maya and Danny sat in the trailer surrounded by the aftermath of their father's secret life. The money remained in the safe, $73,000 that represented payment for work the government would now benefit from. The bulldozer sat in the equipment barn, its hidden compartment empty but its presence a reminder of how close they'd come to making decisions that would have destroyed what little remained of the family's integrity. Marcus Webb lingered, reviewing legal documents with the tired precision of a lawyer who'd seen too many families torn apart by choices made in desperation. The immunity agreement will protect you from prosecution, but it doesn't resolve the financial situation. The auction is still scheduled for Friday unless Garrison withdraws his lien. He'll withdraw it, Maya said with more confidence than she felt. Once he realizes the documents are gone and the federal government is involved, fighting over equipment liens will be the least of his concerns. That evening, as twilight settled over the Thornton yard, Maya walked the perimeter of the land her family had worked for 3 generations. The equipment that would be auctioned sat silent and still, machines that had shaped Earth and built futures now reduced to assets on a liquidation inventory. But the land itself remained, 5 acres of Pennsylvania clay that remembered everything, every mistake and triumph, every season of growth and loss. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, and Maya felt her pulse quicken before she read it. But instead of another threat, the message contained only a question. Your father was a stubborn man. I hope his children are smarter. She deleted the message and blocked the number, refusing to engage with Garrison's attempts at intimidation now that his leverage had evaporated. The documents were gone, the federal government was involved, and whatever power he'd held over the Thornton family had dissolved like morning frost under sunlight. Danny found her standing near the equipment barn, staring at the bulldozer that had contained secrets neither of them had imagined when Eddie Kowalski offered to sell it on credit. You think Dad knew what would happen? Danny asked quietly. That we'd find everything and have to choose between turning it over or becoming criminals ourselves? Maya considered the question, thinking about the letter their father had left, about his instructions to destroy the documents rather than risk giving them to Garrison or facing government scrutiny. I think he hoped we'd be smart enough to walk away. Let the information disappear and move on with our lives. But we didn't. No, Maya said softly. We did what he couldn't bring himself to do. We chose integrity over easy money and cooperation over confrontation. Maybe that's the real inheritance he left us, not the land or the equipment, but the chance to be better than his mistakes. They stood together in the gathering darkness, 2 siblings bound by blood and land and the weight of choices that would echo through whatever future they managed to build from the wreckage of their father's legacy. 3 weeks after the federal agents left with documents that had defined her father's final years, Maya stood in the Thornton equipment yard and watched the bulldozer that had started everything being loaded onto a flatbed trailer. The machine gleamed under October sunlight, its yellow paint restored, its engine running with the smooth confidence of properly rebuilt machinery. Eddie Kowalski supervised the loading process with the careful attention of a man who understood that some sales mattered more than profit margins. The government's asset recovery had moved faster than anyone expected. Within days of receiving Jack Thornton's documentation, teams had begun excavating burial sites across 3 states, recovering equipment that had waited underground for 70 years. The operation made regional news, framed as an environmental remediation project rather than Cold War archaeology, and Maya had watched coverage that never mentioned her father's name or the role he'd played in making the recovery possible. The immunity agreement had come through as promised, formal documents that protected Maya and Danny from prosecution while acknowledging their cooperation. But the compensation Keller had mentioned remained undefined, caught in bureaucratic processes that measured government gratitude in fiscal quarters rather than immediate need. The Friday auction had been canceled when Garrison Industrial Holdings withdrew their lien without explanation, but the underlying debts remained, numbers that would consume the equipment yard piece by piece unless something changed. Eddie approached with paperwork for the Bulldozer sale, his expression carrying satisfaction that went beyond a successful transaction. Buyer's representative just confirmed the wire transfer. $28,000, which covers what you owed me plus a decent profit on your restoration work. Maya signed the documents, still slightly amazed that the machine she'd purchased for $12,000 in desperation had become worth more than double after weeks of systematic repair. The work had consumed every spare hour, transforming the derelict Bulldozer into equipment that actually functioned the way its designers had intended. She'd rebuilt the engine using techniques her father had documented in margins of service manuals, replaced hydraulic systems with modern components that improved on original specifications, and addressed decades of deferred maintenance with the kind of attention that separated mechanics from craftsmen. "You did good work on her," Eddie said, watching the Bulldozer settle onto the trailer. "Your father would have appreciated the attention to detail. He always said the difference between adequate and excellent was whether you cared enough to do things right when nobody was watching." The words hit harder than Maya expected, carrying memories of childhood lessons learned in workshops where Jack Thornton had been patient and focused in ways that disappeared when alcohol or financial pressure entered the equation. He'd taught her to read the language of worn metal, to understand what machinery was trying to communicate through sounds and vibrations, to respect the engineering genius that went into devices designed to move earth and reshape landscapes. After Eddie left, Maya walked through the equipment yard taking inventory of what remained. The backhoe that her grandfather had purchased new in 1967 sat beside the maintenance shed, its paint faded but its mechanisms still sound. The excavator occupied the far corner, partially disassembled from an engine rebuild that Jack had started and never finished. 3 pickup trucks in various states of decay lined the fence, their beds still carrying tools and supplies from jobs completed months or years ago. Danny emerged from the office trailer carrying a laptop, an expression that suggested news of uncertain quality. "The compensation came through," he said, turning the screen so Maya could see an email from the Defense Department's Asset Recovery Division. "They're offering $75,000 for Dad's documentation and verification work, plus an additional $25,000 for cooperation with the investigation." Maya stared at numbers that represented more money than the Thornton family had seen in years. $100,000, enough to pay off the critical debts and give them breathing room to rebuild. But the email continued with details that complicated the simple relief of financial rescue. "They want to hire us as consultants for the ongoing recovery operation." The message explained that Jack Thornton's documentation had proved more accurate and comprehensive than anything the government possessed, and his methods for verifying burial sites could be applied to dozens of additional locations across multiple states. The contract would pay consulting fees that could sustain the business while Maya and Danny decided whether to continue their father's work or pursue different futures. "What do you think?" Danny asked, his voice carrying uncertainty that mirrored her own. "Do we take government money to finish what Dad started, or do we walk away and try to rebuild the construction business the normal way?" Maya thought about her father's letter, about his warning to destroy the documents rather than risk the complications that came with possessing them. He'd tried to protect his children from consequences he'd created, but his protection had assumed they'd make the safe choice, the easy path that avoided federal entanglements in government bureaucracy. "I think Dad spent his life being afraid of making the wrong choice," Maya said slowly. "Afraid to commit fully to the business, afraid to walk away from Garrison's money, afraid to report what he'd found or destroy it completely. He paralyzed himself with caution and ended up making no real choice at all. So what's the right choice now?" Maya looked around the equipment yard, seeing it with eyes that understood how close they'd come to losing everything. The land was safe, protected by the family trust that even Jack's financial disasters couldn't touch. But land without equipment was just dirt, and dirt didn't build futures or employ people or continue legacies that had taken generations to establish. "We take the contract," she decided. "We finish what Dad started, not because we're obligated to but because it's work that matters and work we're qualified to do. And while we're doing it, we rebuild the construction business the right way, with contracts that make sense and clients who pay their bills and financial discipline Dad never managed to maintain." The weeks that followed brought changes that transformed the Thornton yard from a salvage operation waiting to collapse into something that resembled a functioning business. The government's compensation payment cleared debts that had accumulated over years, freeing equipment from liens and giving Maya leverage to negotiate with suppliers who'd cut off Jack Thornton's credit. The consulting contract provided steady income that funded repairs and upgrades, turning machines that barely functioned into assets that could compete for legitimate work. But the deeper transformation happened in ways that couldn't be measured in financial statements or equipment inventories. Maya found herself reading her father's technical notes with new understanding, seeing patterns in his documentation that revealed a mind capable of brilliant insights when focused on problems that engaged him. The man who'd failed so completely at business had excelled at the detective work required to verify burial sites, combining engineering knowledge with historical research and field investigation in ways that impressed even the federal specialists. Danny discovered skills he hadn't known he possessed, translating their father's handwritten notes into digital databases that the Asset Recovery Division could use for planning and verification. He developed systems for organizing information that made the chaos of decades-old documents comprehensible, and his work caught the attention of government archivists who suggested he consider formal training in historical preservation. Marcus Webb stopped by the office trailer one afternoon in November, carrying documents that formalized the business restructuring he'd been shepherding through legal processes. The bankruptcy filing had been withdrawn, debts had been settled or renegotiated, and Thornton Construction existed once again as a solvent entity with actual prospects for survival. "Your father would be amazed," Marcus said, reviewing paperwork that documented the transformation. 3 months ago this business was being liquidated. Now you've got government contracts, paying clients, and equipment that actually works. That's not luck, Maya, that's competence and determination." Maya thought about luck and determination, about the random chance that had led her to Eddie's salvage yard and the bulldozer that contained secrets worth more than the machine itself. If she'd chosen differently at any point, if she'd sold to Garrison or refused to cooperate with federal agents or decided the whole situation was too complicated to navigate, the outcome would have been completely different. Dad used to say that construction was about seeing what could be built before anyone else recognized the potential, she told Marcus. Maybe that's what we've been doing, building something new from the wreckage he left behind. The first snow came in early December, transforming the equipment yard into a landscape that looked cleaner and more hopeful than Maya remembered from previous winters. She stood at the office window watching Danny teach a newly hired mechanic how to diagnose hydraulic problems, their breath forming clouds in the cold air as they discussed pressure readings and seal tolerances. Her phone rang with a number she recognized from previous conversations. Special Agent Keller's voice carried the professional warmth of someone delivering good news. "Miss Thornton, I wanted to update you on the recovery operation. We've now excavated 37 sites using your father's documentation. Total asset recovery is approaching $15 million in equipment and materials. The accuracy of his work has been exceptional." Maya felt pride mixing with grief for a man who'd possessed talents the world never properly recognized. "What happens to the equipment once you recover it?" "Most of it gets sold as surplus," Keller explained. The revenue goes back to the Defense Department to offset recovery costs. But there's a provision in federal acquisition regulations that gives priority to small businesses owned by veterans or their families for purchasing surplus equipment at below market rates. Your father was a veteran, which means Thornton Construction qualifies. The implications settled slowly. You're saying we could buy equipment that's been underground for 70 years? Equipment that your father's work helped locate and recover. Seems appropriate that his family benefits from the success of the operation. I'll send you information about the surplus acquisition process. After the call ended, Maya pulled out a photograph that had sat on her father's desk for as long as she could remember. Jack Thornton in his 20s, standing beside a bulldozer on some long-ago construction site, his expression carrying confidence and promise that the years had gradually eroded. She'd spent so much time angry at what he'd become that she'd forgotten to appreciate what he'd been, a skilled operator with talents that circumstances and personal demons had prevented from flourishing. Danny found her still holding the photograph when he came in from the cold, his face red from wind that cut across the open yard. "The new guy's working out well," he said, warming his hands near the space heater. "He actually listens to instructions and asks questions when he doesn't understand something." Revolutionary concept. Maya smiled at the observation, recognizing how their standards had risen now that they could afford to be selective about who they hired. The desperation that had forced Jack to keep incompetent employees because they were cheap had been replaced by the luxury of choosing people based on skill and reliability. "Danny, do you ever wonder what would have happened if Dad had made different choices? If he'd stayed sober, managed money properly, built the business the way he built that documentation for Garrison?" Danny settled into a chair, his expression thoughtful. "I used to wonder that all the time. But lately I've been thinking that maybe his mistakes were necessary. Not good, not justified, but necessary for us to learn what not to do. We're building something better because we saw what failure looked like up close." The observation carried wisdom that seemed older than Danny's 22 years. And Maya recognized that the past months had transformed her brother from a kid who'd dropped out of trade school into someone capable of genuine insight about human nature and business reality. Christmas approached with the kind of quiet intensity that marked holidays in families that had survived crisis. Maya and Danny drove to visit their mother in Arizona, a trip that felt necessary despite the complicated history that made family gatherings awkward. Catherine Thornton had left Pennsylvania 15 years ago, escaping a marriage that had become unbearable and a business that consumed everything it touched. She'd built a new life in Phoenix, working as a bookkeeper and avoiding conversations about the family she'd left behind. "Whatever you decided, I trust it was the right choice. You have better judgment and stronger character than I ever managed to develop. Build something good from the wreckage I'm leaving behind. Make the Thornton name mean something other than broken promises and unpaid debts." Maya read the letter 3 times, feeling complicated emotions that mixed grief and anger and a kind of sad understanding. Her father had been deeply flawed, damaged in ways that made conventional success impossible, but he hadn't been simply a failure. He'd been a man whose talents didn't match his circumstances, whose demons were stronger than his better instincts, but who'd still managed in his final years to create something of value. She walked out to the equipment yard where the land stretched toward hills that had witnessed 4 generations of Thornton struggles and triumphs. The soil beneath her boots carried memories of every season, every crop, every machine that had worked its surface. The land remembered her great-grandfather returning from war to build something permanent, her grandfather expanding the business through decades of steady growth, her father slowly destroying what he'd inherited while creating documentation that would outlast the business he'd failed to sustain. And now the land held Maya's own story, still being written in choices about integrity and cooperation and the determination to build something better from inherited wreckage. The equipment sat ready for work, the contracts promised income, and the future existed as possibility rather than certainty. Danny joined her, standing quietly beside his sister as they surveyed land that belonged to them through inheritance and sacrifice and the simple fact of survival. The bulldozer that started everything had been sold, its secrets revealed and its purpose fulfilled. But its legacy remained in government contracts and restored equipment and the knowledge that sometimes the most valuable inheritances were the lessons about what not to do. The sun climbed higher, burning off morning mist and revealing the equipment yard in sharp detail. Metal gleamed where Maya had polished away rust. Engines sat ready where her father had left them broken. The land waited patiently for whatever came next, as it had waited through every generation that had tried to shape it toward their dreams. Maya thought about her father's letter, about his hope that she'd be smarter and braver than he'd managed to be. She thought about choices made in desperation that had somehow led to redemption, about federal agents and buried equipment and the strange paths that connected past to present. Mostly she thought about the difference between inheriting failure and learning from it, between accepting what previous generations left behind and building something new from their mistakes. The wind carried sounds across the valley, the distant rumble of traffic on Route 17, the closer noise of equipment being prepared for work, the eternal whisper of air moving through trees that had witnessed everything. The land breathed beneath her feet, patient and enduring, holding stories that would outlast the people who created them. 5 years had passed since the morning Maya first opened the hidden compartment in a salvage yard bulldozer, and the Thornton equipment yard had transformed into something her father would have struggled to recognize. The weathered double-wide trailer that had served as the office for 3 decades had been replaced with a modest steel building that housed actual workspace, organized files, and computers that tracked inventory and contracts with the kind of precision Jack Thornton had never bothered to maintain. The equipment barn stood straight now, its roof repaired properly instead of patched with whatever materials happened to be available. 6 machines sat in organized rows, each one maintained to standards that made breakdowns rare instead of routine. But the changes that mattered most weren't visible in buildings or equipment. They lived in the way Danny spoke to clients, negotiating contracts with confidence that came from understanding both the work and the business. They showed in the crew of 8 employees who arrived each morning knowing their paychecks would clear and their equipment would function properly. They existed in the reputation Thornton Construction had rebuilt one successful project at a time, becoming known again for quality work delivered on schedule instead of for broken promises and financial chaos. Maya stood at the window of the new office on October morning that could have been the twin of the day she'd first visited Eddie's salvage yard, watching frost evaporate from metal under rising sun. The land looked the same as it had looked for generations, rolling hills that framed the valley, fields that turned colors with the seasons, soil that remembered everything even when people forgot. But the relationship between the Thornton family and this land had fundamentally shifted, moving from burden to partnership, from something that demanded everything to something that gave back when treated with respect. The government consulting contract had ended after 3 years, once all the burial sites in Jack Thornton's documentation had been located and excavated. The work had taken Maya and Danny across 6 states, verifying locations and assisting with recoveries that eventually totaled over $40 million in equipment and strategic materials. The Defense Department had recognized their contribution with a commendation that now hung in the office, formal acknowledgement that Jack Thornton's final work had value that extended far beyond the money it generated. But more important than recognition had been the education. Working alongside federal specialists and military historians had taught Maya and Danny things about their father they'd never understood while he was alive. The meticulous attention to detail in his documentation, the creative problem-solving he'd applied to verifying decades-old information, the persistence required to track down sources and confirm locations, all of it demonstrated capabilities that the construction business had never properly utilized. Catherine Thornton had returned to Pennsylvania 18 months ago, not to reclaim any part of the business but to be closer to children who'd built something she could finally respect. She'd found work keeping books for 3 small businesses in Millerton, and she visited the equipment yard most Sundays, walking the perimeter of land she'd fled 15 years earlier. Maya watched her mother's relationship with the property evolve from avoidance to cautious acceptance to something approaching peace. They never spoke directly about Jack or the years of chaos that had preceded Catherine's departure. But sometimes Maya would find her mother standing near the maintenance shed where the restored D7 bulldozer sat, the machine that had been buried for 70 years and now worked with the reliability its designers had intended. Catherine would run her hands along the metal, and her expression would carry memories of a younger version of Jack Thornton, the man she'd married before alcohol and fear had transformed him into someone neither of them recognized. Eddie Kowalski had become something between a business partner and a surrogate grandfather, his salvage yard serving as a pipeline for equipment that Thornton Construction could restore and resell at profit margins that sustained the business during slower periods. He taught Danny the art of seeing value in machines that others dismissed as worthless, the same skill that had led Maya to the Bulldozer that changed everything. On this particular morning, Eddie's wrecker pulled into the yard towing a trailer that carried another piece of salvage history, a 1950s-era excavator that had spent decades working strip mines in West Virginia before being abandoned when the coal industry collapsed. The machine was a disaster of rust and seized mechanisms, but Eddie insisted it was worth the effort of restoration. "She's got good bones," he said, which was his standard assessment of equipment that looked beyond redemption. "Some cleaning, some parts replacement, maybe 6 months of work, and she'll be worth 3 times what I'm asking." Maya circled the excavator, seeing problems accumulate with each step but also recognizing potential that justified the investment. The work would keep her crew employed through winter when construction contracts slowed, and the finished machine would either sell for substantial profit or join Thornton's fleet as an asset that could work for decades. "We'll take her," Maya said, signing paperwork that formalized another gamble based on faith that rusted metal could be transformed into something valuable. It was the same faith that had led her to purchase a Bulldozer 5 years ago, the same faith that had sustained 4 generations of Thorntons who believed that machinery and land and hard work could build futures worth having. The housing development that had been Thornton Construction's first major contract after the restructuring was now complete, 200 homes on land that Maya's crew had graded to tolerances that made the project engineers shake their heads in admiration. The developer had been so satisfied that he'd recommended Thornton for 3 additional projects, and the referrals had created a pipeline of work that extended 2 years into the future. Danny managed the business side now, his natural aptitude for organization and planning finding expression in ways that Jack Thornton's chaos had never allowed. He'd completed online courses in business administration and construction management, filling gaps in knowledge with the kind of systematic effort their father had been incapable of sustaining. At 27, Danny had become the business manager the company had never possessed, someone who understood both the work and the numbers required to make the work profitable. Marcus Webb stopped by the office most weeks, ostensibly to review legal matters but really to witness the transformation of a business he'd tried to save from Jack Thornton's worst impulses. He'd been the Thornton family's lawyer for 30 years, watching 3 generations navigate the complicated relationship between ambition and capability, watching dreams flourish and collapse and somehow survive. "Your grandfather would be proud," Marcus told Maya one afternoon, reviewing contracts that documented the business's steady growth. "He built this company believing that quality work and fair dealing would create something permanent. Your father lost sight of those principles, but you've brought them back. That's not just business success, that's redemption." Maya thought about redemption and legacy, about the difference between inheriting something and earning the right to keep it. The land had always been theirs through legal documents and family history, but the business had needed to be rebuilt from principles that Jack had abandoned. The equipment could be purchased or restored, but the reputation required years of consistent performance to repair. The text message that had threatened her 5 years ago, the warning that her father knew too much, had come from a phone registered to Vincent Garrison's operation. Special Agent Keller had explained during a follow-up conversation that Garrison had been running salvage schemes across multiple states for over a decade, using information from Cold War-era documentation to locate and illegally recover government property. Jack Thornton's documentation had been the most comprehensive source Garrison had ever found, and losing it to federal authorities had essentially destroyed his entire business model. Garrison himself had disappeared before federal charges could be filed, last seen boarding a flight to somewhere in Central America. Keller suggested the man had enough overseas accounts to live comfortably in countries without extradition treaties, and the government had decided that recovering the equipment mattered more than pursuing someone who'd already lost everything that made prosecution worthwhile. Maya occasionally wondered if Garrison thought about the Thornton family, whether he blamed them for his downfall or simply accepted that his scheme had finally collapsed under its own weight. But mostly she didn't think about him at all. The threat he'd represented had evaporated once the federal government became involved, and his importance to her life had diminished to nothing more than a cautionary reminder about the dangers of trying to profit from other people's secrets. Spring arrived with the intensity that followed hard winters, bringing green to fields that had looked dead and coaxing life from soil that had endured months of cold. Maya walked the property boundaries on a morning that smelled of wet earth and new growth, following paths her great-grandfather had established when the land was first acquired. The survey markers were still visible if you knew where to look, iron posts driven deep into clay that had held their positions through decades of weather and growth. She found Danny near the eastern boundary, standing beside the old oak tree where 4 generations of Thorntons had carved their initials into bark that had grown thick around the letters. He'd brought a knife and was adding his own initials below the others, continuing a tradition that connected present to past through simple marks in living wood. "Seems permanent somehow," Danny said, stepping back to examine his work. "Like we're signing a contract with the land, promising to take care of it and trusting it'll take care of us." Maya traced her fingers over her father's initials, carved during a period when Jack had still believed the future held promise instead of just obligations. The letters were weathered but still legible, a reminder that he'd been young once, full of the same hopes and fears that all the Thorntons had carried when they'd stood in this spot and tried to imagine futures that hadn't yet been written. She added her own initials below Danny's, the knife cutting through bark to reveal pale wood beneath. The act felt ceremonial, acknowledging connection to land and family and history that extended beyond individual lifespans. The oak would carry these marks long after everyone who'd carved them was gone, a living record of people who'd believed they belonged to this place and it belonged to them. The first major equipment purchase made entirely from Thornton Construction's own profits was a new excavator, modern and efficient in ways that vintage machines could never match. But Maya had kept the restored D7 Bulldozer, the machine that had been buried for 70 years and now worked alongside contemporary equipment. The contrast was instructive, reminding crews that quality engineering transcended eras and that sometimes the old ways were worth preserving even when new options existed. She'd given the original salvage yard Bulldozer, the machine that had contained her father's secrets, to a technical college that trained heavy equipment operators. The donation had been tax-deductible, but the real value was knowing that students would learn on a machine that carried history in its frame. Maya had installed a plaque that told part of the story, enough to make the Bulldozer memorable without revealing details about hidden compartments in government investigations. Catherine Thornton had started dating someone, a retired engineer who'd worked for the same power company where Tommy Brennan had spent his career before helping with the steam engine restoration. Maya had met him twice and found him steady and kind, qualities her mother deserved after years married to chaos. Catherine seemed lighter somehow, as if returning to Pennsylvania and witnessing her children's success had released guilt she'd carried about abandoning them to deal with Jack's collapse. On a Sunday afternoon in late summer, the Thornton family gathered at the equipment yard for a barbecue that had become annual tradition. Catherine and her engineer friend, Danny, and his girlfriend who worked as a civil engineer for the county, Marcus Webb, and his wife, Eddie Kowalski, and 2 of his grandchildren, the entire Thornton construction crew and their families. 40 people occupying land that had seen so much struggle, celebrating survival and success with the kind of easy joy that came from knowing the worst was behind them. Maya stood slightly apart from the gathering, watching Danny flip burgers on a grill while children played near equipment that sat silent and still on a rare day without work. She thought about her father's letter, about his hope that she'd be smarter and braver than he'd managed to be. The hope hadn't been misplaced, but it also hadn't been entirely fair. She'd had advantages Jack never possessed, the ability to learn from his mistakes rather than make them herself, the luxury of rebuilding from wreckage rather than creating it. Marcus approached with 2 beers, handing one to Maya and settling beside her on the tailgate of a pickup that had belonged to her grandfather. "Your father would have loved this," he said, gesturing toward the gathering. "All these people, all this success built from work he started even if he couldn't finish it himself." Maya sipped the beer, considering the observation. "Do you think he knew? At the end, did he understand that the documentation he created was valuable enough to save what he'd nearly destroyed?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching Catherine laugh at something the engineer had said. "I think he hoped. Your father spent his last months hoping that the work he'd done for Garrison would matter for something beyond just the money. Reading his final letters, seeing the care he put into organizing the documentation, I believe he understood he was leaving you tools to rebuild if you were strong enough to use them. The sun descended toward the hills that ring the valley, painting the sky in shades that reminded Maya of rust and old metal transformed through heat and effort into something stronger. The land beneath her feet had absorbed blood and sweat and tears from 4 generations, had witnessed triumph and disaster in the slow patient work of building futures from inherited possibilities. She thought about the bulldozer that had started everything, about secrets hidden in metal and revelations that had forced choices between easy money and difficult integrity. She thought about her father, flawed and damaged but still capable of creating value in his final years. She thought about Danny, transformed from a dropout into a competent business manager. She thought about her mother, returned from exile to witness redemption she'd never expected to see. The gathering continued until twilight deepened into darkness, families departing with the relaxed satisfaction of time well spent. Eventually only Maya and Danny remained, standing in the equipment yard as stars emerged overhead and the land settled into night quiet. "We did it," Danny said softly. "We took what Dad left behind and built something that actually works. Something that lasts." Maya looked around the yard that had defined her entire life, seeing it with eyes that understood how close they'd come to losing everything and how much effort had been required to salvage anything at all. The equipment sat ready for tomorrow's work. The office held contracts that promised months of employment. The land stretched toward horizons that had witnessed 4 generations and would witness however many more the future held. "We're doing it," she corrected. "This isn't finished. It's just stable enough that we can imagine it continuing." They stood together in the darkness, 2 siblings bound by land and history and the complicated inheritance that came from being born into families that worked earth for living. The bulldozer that had contained secrets was gone, but its legacy remained in choices made and lessons learned and the understanding that sometimes the most valuable inheritances were the problems that forced you to become stronger than you'd imagined possible. Above them, stars wheeled through patterns that had guided travelers for millennia. Below them, soil rested that would wake again with spring and demand attention and give back what was earned through proper care. Around them, equipment waited for hands that understood both machinery and the larger purpose machinery served. The wind carried sounds across the valley, distant traffic and closer rustling of leaves and the eternal whisper of air moving through space where people had lived and worked and built things they hoped would outlast them. The Thornton family had survived 4 generations on this land, had risen and fallen and risen again through cycles that tested whether blood and determination could overcome circumstance and luck. Maya thought about the future, about contracts that would employ crews and equipment that would shape landscapes and the possibility that the Thornton name might someday mean quality again instead of cautionary tales about what happened when talent and discipline diverged. She thought about her father's grave, tended now by people who remembered him with complicated affection, and about the documentation he'd created that had proved more valuable than the business he'd failed to sustain. The land breathed beneath her feet, patient and enduring, holding stories that connected past to present to whatever futures would eventually arrive. The equipment yard sat ready for morning, for work that would continue the endless process of shaping Earth according to human vision. The Thornton family continued, scarred but stronger, carrying forward inheritance that had been earned through survival as much as received through birth. In the distance, lights from Millerton glowed against the darkness, marking a town that had watched the Thornton family struggle and survive across generations. The community would remember Jack Thornton as both cautionary tale and testament to the truth that even damaged people could create value if they found work that engaged their particular talents. They would remember Maya and Danny as the generation that salvaged something from disaster, that chose integrity over easy profit and cooperation over confrontation. The stars continued their ancient patterns overhead. The land waited for whatever came next. And the Thornton family stood on soil that belonged to them through sacrifice and choice and the simple fact of refusing to surrender when surrender would have been easier than persistence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.